The fluorescent lights hummed softly above the empty terminal as the janitor pushed his cart across the polished floor. Every squeak of the wheels echoing like an accusation in the quiet building. He had learned long ago that silence in places like this was never peaceful. It was watchful, waiting, the kind of silence that noticed every mistake, every scuff mark left behind, every breath taken by someone who did not belong in the eyes of those with authority. He wore an old uniform with his name stitched crookedly on the chest, faded from years of washing, years of being invisible, years of being addressed as "Hey you" instead of by his name. He bent down to wipe a stubborn stain near the security checkpoint when a sharp voice cut through the air. "Clean or get arrested, janitor." The words landed heavier than the mop bucket, heavier than the years of swallowed pride. He straightened slowly and turned to see a lieutenant standing there, crisp uniform, polished boots, a badge that caught the light and reflected it back like a challenge. The lieutenant's eyes moved over him, not as a person, but as a problem to be managed. The janitor opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Because explaining yourself to power was often useless. Because dignity had to be rationed carefully in a world that charged interest on it. He simply nodded and went back to scrubbing, his hands steady despite the tremor in his chest. He had been yelled at before, threatened before, reminded again and again that his place was temporary and conditional. But something about the casual cruelty in the lieutenant's tone stirred old memories. Memories of different uniforms, different commands shouted over roaring engines and whipping wind. Memories he kept locked away because they did not fit the story people liked to tell when they looked at him now. Above them, the distant thump of helicopter blades began to grow louder. A routine arrival, nothing special, just another flight crew coming in. The sound vibrated through the building and into his bones. And for a brief moment, he was no longer a janitor in a terminal, but a younger man gripping a headset, scanning the horizon, calculating risks, trusting his crew with his life. The helicopter settled onto the pad outside, and the crew disembarked, laughing, relaxed, carrying themselves with the easy confidence of those who belonged exactly where they were. One of them glanced inside through the glass wall and froze, his eyes narrowing not in suspicion, but in recognition. He nudged another crew member and pointed subtly, and then something remarkable happened. They stopped, all of them, and one stepped forward. Pressing the intercom button, his voice crackled through the terminal speakers as he spoke a call sign. A call sign that had not been spoken aloud in years. A name earned in fire and fear. A name that belonged to the janitor with the mop. The janitor's hand stilled mid-stroke. His breath caught. The lieutenant frowned, confused. Irritated at the interruption, the helicopter pilot repeated the call sign. Louder this time, respect clear in his tone. The janitor slowly looked up, his eyes meeting the glass. And in that moment, the past and present collided. The lieutenant demanded to know what was going on, who they were talking to, but the crew ignored him. Because some hierarchies mattered more than others, the janitor walked toward the glass, each step heavy with disbelief, and the crew snapped to attention. A small gesture, but a powerful one. The lieutenant's face drained of color as he realized he was witnessing something he did not understand. The pilot explained calmly that the janitor was a veteran, a legend to some. A man whose call sign was still spoken with respect in briefing rooms. A man who had saved lives, including possibly theirs. The lieutenant stammered, tried to reassert control, but the balance had shifted. Authority based on rank alone shriveled in the presence of earned honor. The janitor felt a strange mix of vindication and sadness. Because recognition felt good, but also late. Because it should not have required a helicopter crew to remind the world of his worth. He did not gloat, did not raise his voice. He simply stood there, shoulders squared, the mop forgotten, and nodded once in acknowledgement of the crew, a silent thank you. A silent affirmation of who he had been and who he still was. The lieutenant cleared his throat and muttered an apology that sounded more like a formality than remorse. Then quickly retreated, suddenly very busy elsewhere. The terminal returned to its quiet hum, but it was no longer the same silence. It carried weight now. History. The janitor returned to his cart. The crew saluted once more before leaving. And as the helicopter lifted off, its blades beating the air, the janitor felt something inside him settle. Not anger, not triumph, but a quiet resolve. He understood that the world would continue to judge by appearances. That uniforms could be changed and titles stripped away, but character endured. He finished cleaning the terminal with the same care as before. Not because he feared arrest, but because work done with integrity needed no audience. As he clocked out later that night, he caught his reflection in the glass. An older man with tired eyes and a steady gaze, and he smiled faintly, knowing that no matter what anyone called him now, janitor or veteran, he knew his own name, his own story. And that was something no lieutenant could ever take away. The night air outside was cool as he stepped into it. The distant sound of the helicopter fading into memory, and for the first time in a long while, he walked home feeling seen, not by the world, but by himself, carrying the quiet strength of a life lived in service. Resilience forged in moments no badge could measure, and the understanding that respect, real respect, did not come from threats or shouted orders, but from the unspoken bond between those who had faced the sky together and returned, changed but unbroken. And even as tomorrow promised more floors to clean and more people to overlook him, he knew that somewhere above, in the air he once ruled, his call sign still meant something, and that was enough. The next morning began like any other. The janitor arrived before sunrise when the building still slept and the world felt softer. He preferred these hours because no one watched him closely then. No one measured his worth by the shine of the floor or the speed of his hands. He moved through the terminal with practiced rhythm, mop dipping, ringing, gliding, each motion almost meditative. But inside his mind, the events of the previous night replayed again and again. The lieutenant's sharp voice, the sudden recognition, the call sign echoing through the air like a ghost from another life. He wondered if it had really happened, or if exhaustion had finally blurred his memories into fantasy. Yet the faint warmth in his chest told him it was real. Recognition always left a trace, even when brief. As the sun crept up and light spilled through the glass walls, the terminal began to fill with people. Travelers dragging luggage, security officers changing shifts, supervisors scanning clipboards, and among them was the lieutenant. Stiff as ever, but noticeably quieter. His eyes flicked toward the janitor, and then away, as if unsure how to place him now. That uncertainty amused the janitor more than it angered him. Because fear and confusion often hid behind authority, he continued working, giving no sign that anything had changed, but something had. Inside him a long dormant voice had stirred, reminding him of who he had been when mornings meant briefings and flight plans, not cleaning schedules. When responsibility meant lives depending on clear judgment, rather than complaints about missed spots. As he wiped down a railing, a young security officer approached hesitantly, respectful, almost shy, and thanked him quietly for his service. Word traveled fast in places like this. The janitor nodded and told him to stay safe. The simplicity of the exchange grounded him. There was no need for speeches or medals, just acknowledgement. Later during his break, he sat alone with a cup of weak coffee, staring out at the runway, watching planes taxi like patient beasts. And memories flooded back uninvited. Night missions with visibility near zero. The trust built wordlessly between crew members. The weight of decisions made in seconds that echoed for years. He remembered the day he chose to leave, not because he lacked courage, but because the cost had grown too high, because every takeoff carried ghosts and every landing brought new ones. Civilian life had promised quiet, anonymity, a chance to fade into the background, but anonymity came with its own price. Invisibility. People looked through him now. Saw only the uniform he wore and the job it represented, not the life behind it. Not the discipline and sacrifice etched into his posture. He had accepted that trade willingly, or so he told himself. Until last night cracked that belief open. A supervisor interrupted his thoughts to remind him of a spill near Gate 7. And he returned to work, pushing his cart past a group of travelers arguing loudly. One of them nearly bumped into him and muttered an insult under his breath. The janitor paused, took a steadying breath, and moved on, choosing peace over pride. But the choice felt different now. Not like surrender, but like control, because he knew the difference. By midday, the helicopter crew returned briefly to refuel. And this time they came inside, not with fanfare, but with purpose. They approached him during his lunch break, offering a handshake, sharing a few quiet words. Stories overlapping like old maps. They spoke of training exercises, of near misses, of names remembered and names lost. The janitor listened more. Even he spoke, content to let the past breathe without consuming him. The lieutenant watched from a distance, his expression unreadable. Perhaps reconsidering his own assumptions, perhaps not. Change rarely came easily to those who relied on rank to define them. When the crew left, one of them clapped the janitor on the shoulder and told him he still flew straight. The words lingered long after the sound of rotors faded. The rest of the shift passed without incident, but the janitor noticed subtle shifts. A little more courtesy, a little less barking. As if the building itself had adjusted its posture. That evening as he clocked out, a supervisor asked if he had ever considered applying for a different role. Something with training or safety oversight. The question surprised him. He answered honestly that he would think about it, walking home under a darkening sky. He realized that dignity was not something others could grant or revoke permanently. It lived in choices, in how one carried themselves when no one was watching. The lieutenant's threat had been an attempt to strip that dignity away. But the helicopter crew's recognition had simply revealed it. As he reached his door, he paused, looking up at the open sky, listening to the distant hum of aircraft. And for the first time in years, he allowed himself to imagine a future not defined solely by the past or by the mop in his hands, but by the totality of who he was, a man who had served, who still served in quieter ways, who understood that respect earned in the air did not vanish on the ground. It merely waited to be remembered, and as he stepped inside, he felt ready. Not to reclaim an old life, but to live fully in the one he had. With eyes open, spine straight, and a calm certainty that no threat, however loudly spoken, could erase a life of meaning. Weeks passed and the terminal settled back into its routines. But beneath the surface something subtle had shifted. The janitor felt it in the way people paused before speaking to him. In the way his presence seemed to register now rather than blend into the background. He did not seek attention, and he did not tell his story unless asked. But stories have a way of leaking out through gestures, posture. The calm confidence of someone who has faced far worse than a dirty floor or a harsh word. Each morning he arrived early as always, the smell of cleaning solution mixing with jet fuel. The sound of distant engines humming like a familiar lullaby. And he worked with the same care. Because discipline did not disappear when circumstances changed, it simply adapted. One afternoon a training drill caused delays and tension rippled through the terminal. Tempers flared, supervisors barked orders. Travelers complained loudly. And in the chaos a young officer froze when an alarm sounded unexpectedly. Unsure of protocol, the janitor noticed immediately. Not because it was his job, but because instinct never truly sleeps, he moved calmly. Guiding the officer through the steps, his voice steady, cutting through panic like a blade through fog. The situation resolved quickly, no harm done, but those nearby noticed. Later a safety manager approached him, curious. asking where he had learned to stay so composed. The janitor smiled faintly and said simply that pressure teaches you or breaks you. That evening an email circulated among management, praising his quick thinking. The lieutenant's name appeared as a CC, silent but present. The janitor felt no satisfaction in that, only a quiet acknowledgement that competence eventually speaks for itself. Even in places that value titles over talent, days turned into months and the supervisor's earlier question returned. This time with a formal offer, a position assisting with safety training. Part-time at first, sharing experience with younger staff. The janitor hesitated, not out of fear, but out of respect for the life he had built. Change always carried weight, yet he accepted. Understanding that growth did not mean abandoning humility, it meant expanding service. His uniform changed slightly, the name patch replaced. But he still helped clean when needed, refusing to draw sharp lines between roles. Some people were confused by that, others inspired. The lieutenant eventually approached him directly. Awkward, defensive, then surprisingly sincere. Offering an apology without excuses, admitting he had judged without knowing. The janitor listened, not to forgive dramatically, but to close a loop that no longer needed tension. He nodded, acceptance quiet and complete. Because holding on to resentment was heavier than any mop bucket, the helicopter crew visited occasionally, always exchanging a knowing glance, a brief smile, no spectacle required. One evening as the janitor now trainer walked across the tarmac after a late session, he paused to watch a helicopter lift into the darkening sky. Its lights blinking steadily, and he felt no longing, only appreciation. He had flown his missions, carried his share of risk. And now his role was different, but no less meaningful. He was shaping calm in others, passing on lessons paid for dearly. At home his life was simple, meals cooked slowly. Nights spent reading or listening to the distant echo of aircraft. Contentment replaced restlessness. He understood now that identity was not a single chapter, but a collection. Janitor, veteran, mentor, each valid, each connected. The world would continue to misjudge people based on appearances. Uniforms, accents, jobs. But that was a limitation of the world, not of the people it overlooked on the anniversary of his service. He did not attend ceremonies or seek recognition. Instead he worked a normal shift, helping a nervous trainee find confidence, and that felt right. Because honor lived in action, not applause. As he locked up the terminal late that night, the building quiet once more. He stood for a moment in the center of the floor he once scrubbed under threat, now gleaming under soft lights, and he breathed deeply, grounded, whole. The past acknowledged, the present embraced, the future open. And when he finally turned off the lights and stepped outside, the sky above wide and endless, he walked forward without looking back, carrying with him the unshakable truth that a person's worth was never defined by the loudest voice in the room, but by the quiet strength they carried when no one was watching.